We often talk about, as a journalist, I talk about freedom of speech and press, but it's also freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. And if you want to just reread it, your chairs all have copies of the Constitution.
Let me show, don't tell. It is important and very, very sort of serious business in these particular times.
We talk about free speech, free press, free markets, lots of sorts of freedom. We don't ever interrogate the concept of freedom itself. And a lot of them in their conversations or their reflections will often come back with answers like, well, we need control. Control is necessary to maintain order. And I find this to be deeply troubling to a certain degree, especially when I ask them to think about freedom. Like they can't even imagine a freedom outside of some sort of necessary control.
We have a presidential administration that is setting a tone of disrespecting dissent and a lack of respect or interest in accommodating the press in its duty, that's sort of again an extension of the First Amendment to inform the public about what's going on at the highest levels of government, and that's concerning.
Today we had the inauguration of President Donald Trump, who's now taken office. And yeah, obviously a major historical event. And tonight what we're going to be talking about is the state of the First Amendment and some of the threats that President Trump has made against the press, opening up libel laws, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk generally about the state of the First Amendment and what answer some questions that people may have about it.
It's a great time to be teaching about the First Amendment, in the classroom and sort of in public, I guess, in terms of public engagement, talking with people. There's lots of things to talk about. There's lots of things to discuss. There's sort of issues coming up every day that are worth talking about. But it's also a bit worrisome because the reason that we have a lot of things to talk about is because folks in government and high positions of government have made some statements and made some indications that they don't value First Amendment rights and other civil liberties in ways that are sort of traditional in our American democracy. And so that's something, again, a reason to talk about it, but also a reason, I think, to be concerned in some ways.
I was a cub reporter at Fortune magazine, and I had a chance to write about a New York real estate developer named Donald Trump, who was having a very high-profile divorce triggered by an affair that was in all the tabloid newspapers. And this was obviously too sordid a story for the experienced reporters, so they gave it to the kid right out of college. And I recently went back and looked up this story that I wrote, I think in 1989, perhaps. I remember, I was writing for a business magazine. I took the financial approach, and I wrote that Donald had given Ivana Trump such a small divorce settlement that it really raised questions about whether his supposed multi-billion-dollar net worth was really quite so high, or if he was exaggerating that. And so I wrote this when I was 23 years old. And so I mentioned this yesterday to Dean Al Stavitsky, the dean of the journalism school, who's in the back, and he said, Deutschman, if you did that today, immediately Trump would have tweeted, incompetent child Deutschman writing an overrated Fortune magazine gets story wrong. Sad, exclamation point. And what Al didn't say, but what I fully expect, is within hours I would have received tremendous harassment and possibly even death threats, or threats to myself and to my family and to my young child. That's something I never had to worry about in a quarter century of writing very critical stories of many of the most powerful people in America, writing about fellow billionaires. I felt that as long as I got the story right, I was untouchable and could be fearless.
We get so many different stories and so many different perspectives that we did not get before because they were not going to be the leading story because it didn't bleed enough, or we didn't have the capacity or the finances in our different journalism spaces to be able to really get the support to go after that story a little bit further. So there has been years now of contention with regards to who are the real storytellers and whose narrative should we really believe. And is it legitimate if it's a blog? Is it legitimate if it's just a post? And right now, this idea of fake news, right? Like, what is real and what is not? And so, for me, it's definitely a fine line and a double-edged sword. But I am all for being able to tell a story and being able to tell your truth, whether someone can contest it or not, making that more accessible to the general public. I think we benefit from the last 10, 15 years by having that and making that accessible than not.
The government literally controls the telecommunications companies, have had to set up autonomous networks outside of the government eye, right? And so they blip up, they erect something called a mesh network where they draw down a signal, get out their messages, and then disappear and move. Because otherwise, if you can be watched by the government, speech in those areas, and I have personal friends who have had their lives threatened and in fact assassination attempts for what they said against the Ethiopian regime, for example, or the Syrian regime. So domestically, that we also have, if you've been paying attention, there are now records of, for example, we've got the application, that's one thing, but then there's also the infrastructure, and those are the companies that control our access to connecting with one another, the AT&Ts, the Comcast, et cetera, et cetera. There's a recent leaked document that came out to show that AT&T was actually selling data to local law enforcement agencies on people living within their domain. It's called Project Hemispheres. If you want to you can look up information on that.
The First Amendment, the Constitution in general, is a document of optimism, right? Which is to say that it's born of the Enlightenment, which is to say that we sort of lay this at the feet of the people to sort of say it's going to be up to you to make your truth as you see it, elect your government as you see the government, as you see the future of the country being as it should go, and that the sort of the marketplace concept of the truth will find its way to the surface when put sort of in an open encounter with falsehood.